Hey guys, another video for you. This time I wanted to talk a little bit about getting off of buprenorphine, otherwise known as suboxone. So this is a controversial subject because even though I think intuitively we think that people will make progress in control of their chemical dependency and should be able to taper off of the medicine. Generally, studies, although these studies are pretty short term, usually several months as opposed to several years, but the studies have shown that staying on buprenorphine results in much lower risk of relapse than tapering people off. So when people come into my office the first time, a lot of the times people ask, well, how fast can I get off? And, my usual response is something like, well, how much progress you make in developing coping mechanisms so that when you get stressed out or whatever, you don't feel like using as much. So it kind of depends upon the severity of somebody's chemical dependency and how much work they're doing and really how many times they've been tested. So, there are times when somebody's tapering off of buprenorphine and on the way out of the office I say, well, I hope something a little bit shitty happens in the next, few months to test out these new coping mechanisms so that you feel confident that you don't have the same risk of relapse as you did in the past and you can continue to taper off. Because I think a lot of people, whether they say it or not, kind of fear themselves. They've struggled before, they've thought that they had it under control before, and then something happens or whatever, and then they relapse, and it's not pleasant, and it's disheartening, and people lose faith in their ability to make progress in chemical dependency. But regardless, I think that at some point most of my patients should begin to taper off of buprenorphine. And so usually I have people kind of go through, the 4 different stages, which is number 1, start on buprenorphine at whatever dose is necessary. I don't care what dose it is. Number 2, consolidate into a single daily dose once you get down to 16 milligrams a day. And so, that's kind of 2 steps. 1 is to taper down to 2 8-milligram tablets a day or less, and then consolidate that dose into a single daily dose. Step 3, taper off. And step 4, stay in control, don't relapse without being on buprenorphine. And each one of those, is a substantial step. First of all, recognize that you need some help getting into the office, starting on buprenorphine. That takes some courage and some self-discovery to say, I need some help. And then starting on buprenorphine, getting that down to that single daily dose so that you're not taking little bits here and there. You're constantly thinking about, is it time for buprenorphine? Is it time for buprenorphine? So just kind of get over that hump. Take all the buprenorphine, single time, same dose every day, 16 milligrams a day, and then begin tapering down. So step 3, tapering down. Usually I have people reduce the dose no more often than every 2 weeks, because it takes time for your brain to catch up, for those neuro receptors to reorganize themselves, and so that's typically what I recommend. And then typically no more than about 2 milligrams a day until you're down to 2 milligrams a day, and then at that point you slow down even further. Just because of the way buprenorphine works, those first few milligrams you take are a lot more potent than the last few milligrams you take. So those first couple milligrams, they pack a lot of punch, and so you have to slow it down a little bit when you are getting back off of it again. So usually a quarter of a 2 milligram tablet is a half a milligram at a time, no more often than every 2 weeks. And then a lot of times once you get down to that last quarter of a 2, taking one of those every other day, because the half-life of buprenorphine is quite long. So typically, you can really smooth it out at the end there. And then, a lot of times once people stop completely after taking that half a milligram every other day for 2 weeks, Sometimes we have a little problems with insomnia, so we'll try, some Ambien or, whatever, some sort of sleep aid for 3 to 5 nights to kind of get people through that. But typically, you're not having the nausea, vomiting, sweats, aches, the whole full opioid withdrawal as you're tapering that dose down. So that's kind of the mechanics of getting off. And as I mentioned before, when you're thinking about getting off of buprenorphine, you have to recognize, are you ready? And this is another area of controversy. How do you know somebody is ready? Some of my patients are getting off of buprenorphine way too fast, and I think that they're running the risk of relapse, or their risk of relapse is greater, because I don't think that they've had enough experience dealing with stressful events, dealing with their lives without using opioids enough that they can really, have a lot of faith in those new non-chemical coping mechanisms. Other people, I'm like, you got to taper down. Like, I'm going to force you to taper down. Now, once people get down to 16 milligrams a day, which is 2/8 a day, I think people should taper down, but I don't, generally not enforcing it. But, some of my patients have been on buprenorphine for 8, 9, 10 years now. And, I think it's time for them to continue to taper off completely. But, again, that's an area of controversy. And if somebody says to me, listen, I am perfectly fine on this low dose, less than 8 milligrams a day, 2 milligrams a day, 4, 6 milligrams a day, and I want to stay on here on this dose forever, it's hard to say no, because that's a very low dose, it's a very safe medicine, and if it helps them with their chemical dependency and they don't relapse, like, what's the problem? Like, why should you get off? And again, do you need to take it? Is it just kind of like that safety blanket or whatever? And the analogy that I sometimes use is that, when people come to me, a lot of times, to use this analogy, they're out there in the ocean, they're drowning. The waves are just hitting them, they're just barely keeping up, and then I throw them the buprenorphine, the suboxone, and they grab onto it. And, they're like, oh man, this is great, this saved my life, And then over the next couple of years, they're learning to swim on their own, without that life preserver of buprenorphine. And then eventually I'm like, all right, give it back. You got to give up the buprenorphine. And they're like, well, you're crazy. Like, this thing saved my life. Like, there's no way I'm going to give this thing up. And I'm like, well, you learned to swim. You don't need the life preserver anymore. You've been through a bunch of stressful events. You've gone to classes or meetings or whatever. You have a good, history of management of this chemical dependency. You don't need it anymore. And so, in a cautious and compassionate way, hopefully, we have this discussion, okay, how are we going to get you back off of this medicine? Now, luckily enough, I don't have enough patients that have hit my ceiling, and so I can take new patients in. But for a lot of practices, they're maxed out, and they, whether they're licensed for 30 or 100 or 275 patients, there's not any more room in their practice for new people that need help. So it's important to kind of get people on buprenorphine through recovery, developing those chemical dependency skill sets, those non-chemical coping skills, I call it, and then to have them transition off, because you can only have so many patients in your practice. So other practices are much more strict about tapering people off, because otherwise just people will just hang out in the program, and then the program can't help new people. And so currently I don't have that problem. I have had that problem in the past, though. At one point, we had a waiting list of like 20 people just due to some issues with providers leaving the island or whatever. But but right now that isn't a problem. And so again, there's no perfectly clear answer as to who should taper off, when they should taper off. But I think that overall, if you've been doing well, that you've had some stressful events, you have not relapsed, and you've kind of shown that your risk of relapse is low, I think considering tapering off is probably a good idea. And doing it slow, going down every 2 weeks is just that's the fastest that I recommend going down. Other people are going to take a dose reduction every 3 weeks or every 4 weeks or every 3 months. And you know, I have patients who, you know, I'm like, okay, we're gonna stretch this out over a year. So, you know, over this next year, we're going to taper down from, you know, 4 pills down to 3 pills. And then, you know, so I'm like, okay, this is going to be like a 4 or 5 year process for you. But again, that's negotiable. And generally speaking, if you're taking 16 milligrams a day or less of buprenorphine, I think that that's a fine place to just stay at to maintain your, you know, your control over opioid dependence. So anyway, those are a few ideas I have about getting off of suboxone. Thanks so much.